Good evening, everyone. My name is Sophie Lowe. I'm the Deputy Director here at the museum at Eldridge Street, and I am so thrilled to be here with all of you this evening, along with our partners at the Seward Park Library branch of the New York Public Library. We've been extremely fortunate to have this opportunity made possible in part by the Institute of Museum and Library Science as part of the Museum Association of New York's Building Capacity Project. Tonight's Zoom is captioned and it is also being recorded. And we encourage you to ask questions throughout the program via the chat box. Tell us where you're tuning in from today. And there will be opportunities for Q&A at the end. Today, we are going to hear from Scott Brevda of the museum at Eldridge Street and Andrew Fairweather of the Seward Park Library on how the history of the Lower East Side can be told through the lens of our respective institutions. The museum at Eldridge Street, which is housed in the Eldridge Street Synagogue, and the Seward Park Library both represent different facets of life on the Lower East Side from the late 19th century to the present. And also let us know if you've been to either the museum at Eldridge Street or Seward Park Library. The Seward Park Library and the Seward Park itself was formed to meet the residents' physical needs and intellectual needs, while the Eldridge Street Synagogue formed to meet the neighborhood's new immigrants, congregants, cultural and spiritual needs. And both institutions were molded into what they are now by the neighborhood's history, and the neighborhood was in turn molded by these institutions. And this evening, we will tell you their stories. Our first speaker today is Scott Brevda. Scott is the Senior Educator and Visitor Services Operations Manager at the museum at Eldridge Street. And as a historian, museum educator, and a lifelong New Yorker, Scott loves to bring the history of his native city to life. And in his current position at Eldridge, Scott manages the museum's day-to-day operations and leads and coordinates and develops educational programs at the museum. And he was also formerly a senior educator at the Lower East Side Tenement Museum. And he holds a bachelor's and master's in history from Fordham University. And Andrew has been a librarian at the Seward Park Library branch of the New York Public Library on New York's Lower East Side for the past 10 years. And in his time at the library, he has provided lots and lots of different kinds of programming, from local history tours to genealogy workshops and lectures on literature and philosophy. And he told me that he enjoys reading, painting, and other quiet sports. So after this program, I invite all of you to come to the museum at Eldridge Street and Seward Park Library to say hi. And Scott, please take it away.
Thank you very much, Sophie, and thanks to everybody for coming tonight. When we think about the history of the Lower East Side, it is a massive history going back over 400 years. There have been many peoples who have lived there, from the Lenape to the Dutch to the English, British, German, the Jews of the Lower East Side, and many more thereafter. Of course, it's too much of a history to do all of it in 1 hour, so we are looking today through the lens of our two institutions, and specifically at the late 19th and early 20th centuries. This was an era that saw great change in the Lower East Side and in the New York City as a whole. In this period, about 2.5 million Eastern European Jewish immigrants would come from nations that today include Poland and Belarus and Ukraine and Latvia, Estonia, Lithuania, Hungary, and Romania, all to make a new life here in New York City. When they left, they would leave everything behind. They would sell off what tangible physical property they owned, taking only what they could carry or what they could wear on them. And as you can see here on this image of the SS Patricia, arriving in New York Harbor in 1906, there was literally no room to stand on the ship. When they would come to the Lower East Side, they were coming into a neighborhood that was equally as crowded. And in some ways, they could feel right at home. They would have the push cart markets you can see here in the street. This is, by the way, what I might call a quiet day in the Lower East Side. And here the residents are buying and selling, they're haggling over the price of goods. They're buying and selling their wares. If you also look behind through the bricks of these buildings, you can also get a sense of the crowdedness of this neighborhood. There were tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people crowded into these city streets and into the tenement apartments that still help define them. In these streets and in these tenements, these immigrants, these new residents of New York City and of the Lower East Side would be building their new lives essentially from the ground up. They would have to see first to their most essential needs: food, clothing, and shelter. Once those were done, however, they would turn to other needs that they would have, perhaps equally as necessary. And those would be the ones that our two institutions, the museum at Eldridge Street and the Eldridge Street Synagogue and the Seward Park Library, would help to serve. And so, as Sophie said, we are going to be taking a look at some of those stories today. For synagogues, some of the first were not purpose-built synagogues as ours is rather. Among the first are steebles or storefront synagogues, synagogues that are in buildings that either have a dual purpose or in some ways have a secondary function. You can see on the left-hand side, this is a current steeple on East Broadway. It's in the front of a apartment building, and that door leads to the basement where the steeple would be located. Steeples could also be in the apartments themselves, share in the living room, in the front of an apartment building instead of a store. They could literally be anywhere, sometimes even in garment shops, which could also be living rooms. Eventually, though, as the community began to build a foundation for themselves, financially and otherwise, they would begin to build things a little bit more larger in terms of scale and grandeur. We see the Bialystoker Synagogue on the right, which is another beautiful example. But that building was actually constructed as an Episcopal church in the Georgian style, and it was converted into a synagogue many years later. In 1886, one congregation in the Lower East Side decided to build something a bit more grand, something purpose-built. And in fact, what they would build, the Eldridge Street Synagogue, where we're located today, became the oldest grand house of worship built by Eastern European Jews in the United States. It only took 9 months to build at a cost of about $90,000, but even those numbers are a little misleading. $90,000 in 1887 would be about $25 to $30 million today. And that doesn't even take into account the recent fluctuations in inflation. So it could be worth even more here in 2022. The building that they would build was epic in its scale, and it was grand, and it spoke to the wish of the neighborhood, and really particularly the congregation, to build something that would announce their presence here in the city, something that could compare to St. Patrick's Cathedral, the Temple Emmanuel, and to other grand houses of other denominations and other faiths. It was them expressing their desire of permanence here, that they had in essence arrived. The facade of our synagogue, which you see here, is built primarily in a Moorish style. You do see some Romanesque and Gothic elements, particularly the rose window. I'm going to get my laser pointer here to show you in the center. But even this facade, in some ways, doesn't really tell the whole story of the building. Because when you come inside, you are literally transported to a different world. Worlds away from the tenement apartment and the street scene that you saw a few moments ago. In that way, the synagogue also was helping the community and was shaped by their desire to find a space where they can get away from the day-to-day, from the monotonous, from the cramped spaces. The main sanctuary, which you see here just behind the facade, is over 50 feet tall with over 60 windows inside. Most of them are the original design and have been restored over a 20-year, $20 million restoration project. The one exception, of course, is the large blue window here in the eastern wall. That's a 2010 installation by Kiki Smith. But what you're seeing here is their desire to find something a little bit different, to get into space with light and air, also to find something where the congregants could go into their prayers in a place of awe. In many ways, please pardon the pun, they were looking for something of a religious experience. The other thing that you would see here in the synagogue, and in some ways separate and apart from the religious aspect of the synagogue itself, was this building as a meeting place for the broader community. Indeed, we know that in this period, people of the Lower East Side of various nationalities and in some cases religions would come here for civic purposes, whether you were coming for the dispersal of charity aid in the event of a tenement house fire, or perhaps more prominently in 1900, there was actually a civic meeting held here of local town residents to address an issue in the neighborhood. It was not something confined to the Jewish community because we know that a Roman Catholic priest was invited to speak here at the synagogue about this topic. When you consider the building and you look at all of the facets, the one thing I can say about it, more than perhaps anything else, is that it is our most important artifact. There is so much here that tells us about the congregants and about the Lower East Side at the time, that there's really too much to talk about in 1 hour. But I do want to share with you a few of my favorites. And what you're looking at is actually my top favorite. It's not the elegantly carved wood moldings or the stained glass windows or the intricate brass fixtures. It's actually the floorboards. These were put in towards the end of the construction of the building. And by that point, the congregation had gotten into some financial trouble. It had cost them a lot of money. And in fact, they had a mortgage. It would take them until 1945 to pay off. So they were looking to figure out a way to save as much money as they could while still finishing the space in the appropriate way. One of the places they thought they could spend a little bit less were the floorboards. This is in contrast with the Ark and the Bema, which are central to services. They'd be used to house and read the Torah, respectively. Now, they were made of Italian walnut, which were imported. Similarly, the benches, which you can see in the background, were made of oak. The floorboards, though, were made of a pine wood, a soft wood. And what you're looking at, if you look closely, it is somewhat faint here, is the curvature in the floor. As men and women on the upper floor would pray here, they would shuckle, that is to say, rock back and forth from their heels to their toes. And if you actually put your feet on the ground, you can mirror their action by rocking your feet back and forth as you watch. Over the decades of people praying here, they're slowly going to press their footprints down into the floorboards. It's my favorite part because you can actually step into the footprints of these congregants. It's literally standing in the footprints of history. It's not something you can find many places else. And in its own way, that too speaks to the congregation's desire to preserve their traditions and practices. And the synagogue was one of those places they would do that. This was challenged by the realities of New York at the time, particularly the Sabbath, which was obstructed by the work week. 6 days a week back then. It would stretch from Monday to Saturday with this Sunday, the Christian Sabbath, off. Many employers, including a few Jewish factory owners, would want their own workers to work that work week regardless of the religious rules. It was one of a number of ways in which the Jewish cultural and religious experiences was challenged here in the Lower East Side. But here at the Eldridge Street Synagogue, they were making their attempts as best they could to preserve them. Once we go beyond the building, though, if we want to get a sense of the people, get really a feel for the atmosphere, we do have to turn to primary sources. Now, this image or etching that you see in front of you, until recently, we thought it was the oldest etching of the interior of the sanctuary and the oldest depiction of services being happening. This was first published in Century Magazine in about 1890, so only about 2 to 3 years into the congregations and the buildings being. And you can see so much great detail here, from the little curtains on the top of the balcony. Let me get my laser pointer for everyone. Which are right up here, to the men praying down here in their Saturday best, their top hat and tailcoats. Even the gentleman all the way up here near one, who is perhaps in seat number 1, which is the most important and most expensive seat in the house, praying into the wall to the east, trying to preserve that tradition as well. But we actually discovered quite recently a newer source, a newer primary source that sheds even more light into the history of the building and the congregation, really into the neighborhood itself. And that came from the New York Sun. They dispatched two journalists and perhaps also an illustrator to the congregation's first Passover services in 1888. They were not Jewish themselves, and they paint a beautiful picture of the services happening from eyes that hadn't witnessed it before and reveal details that we really didn't have until now. On your screen is one of my favorite passages from this article. And in it, the journalists wrote that the black silk hats, brown derbies, and fur caps worn by 300 or 400 men in the synagogue, or to Christian or otherwise unfamiliar eyes, are elements of incongruity difficult to forget. A few of the men receded in prayer in the pews, gravely contemplating the beautifully embroidered curtain before the ark. Most of them were standing in little groups in various parts of the room, chatting vivaciously in Polish, Russian, or German, with now and then perhaps a phrase or two in some strange dialect that might have been Hebrew or attempted Yiddish. There was little of the subdued tone and manner that characterized the assembling of Christian congregants for worship. There were no bowing of the heads upon the backs of the pews next to the front, no kneeling upon the bench and recitation of prayer. The journalists would also, in this article, get to interview a number of the congregants who told us a few things that we never knew until then. They told us, one in particular always catches my attention, that Pinchas Minkowski, who was our first cantor, was such a noted singer, a tenor to be specific, that in attendance during most of the services were not just members of the congregation or even the broader Jewish community, but also non-Jewish New Yorkers who were coming to the synagogue just to listen to the prayers, perhaps with some idea as to what they meant, or perhaps not. In its own way, you might even say that there have been concerts at the museum at Eldridge Street from its earliest days. The two journalists from the New York Sun also left us what are perhaps the definitively the oldest illustrations of the services and of the interior of the sanctuary. And they are fantastic, and I've really been enjoying going through them since we've discovered this article. I'd love to share them with you. The first one we have here is of the women in the balcony. You can see the women on the image, the black and white etching on the right. And I love the detail that was paid, even not just to the women and their hats, but also to the wood structure here below them, which you can still see in our synagogue today. This is an image of the balcony. They don't have the stained glass window in the background, but you can just imagine the women sitting right here in these pews in the women's balcony, attending service day in and day out. Another great etching is of Pinchas Minkowski, the cantor I mentioned earlier. He's up here. The cantor, separate and in some ways similar, but separate from the rabbi, he would sing during services. And in Pinchas Minkowski's case, also organized the choir. You can see Minkowski here at the podium, which still stands to this day in his robes and hat with 3 members of his choir directly behind him. One thing I particularly find fascinating about this image is up here on the top left corner. You can see the same wood structure that we have still today in the original wood podium. The third image, though, is most certainly my favorite. It's a different view of Minkowski with a much larger and inclusive view of the choir behind him. And this is facing the ark. But we can't see many details of the individuals, Minkowski or anyone else for that matter. You can see a lot of the ark behind it. And if you compare it to the image on the right, which is the ark today, there is a lot that is exactly the same. From the columns, here just on either side of the curtain, which you can see in the image, to the eternal light hanging just above the curtain, to the candles, which may or may not have been a Hanukkah or menorah. And my personal favorite are these fixtures, which you can also see the orbs and the tubes of over here. What I love about them is the tubes, the necks for these fixtures. In the image on the left, you can see that they're pointed up, but in the ones today, they're actually pointed down. That's not a mistake in either one. The fixtures were originally pointed up prior to 1907 when the building was electrified. Afterwards, they turned them down. So it is one of those details that I love to see, one era to the next. As we move into the 1920s and 30s, into the 20th century, we can see too that the museum was affected and in some ways swept up by broader societal and political movements. This is true in particular with the progressive and suffragette era and the movements that are attached to them. One of my favorite stories takes place in 1902 during what's known as the Great Kosher Meat War, the kosher meat boycott. During that time, women of the Lower East Side were protesting against the meat consortium, which had decided to fix the price of meat. They included all of the meat distributors, and so they could fix the price of meat, and decided to raise the price up 50% per pound. The women of the neighborhood would begin to protest with signs and leaflets, and even political cartoons like the one you can see on the right. It's written in Hebrew, but in essence, what it's showing is the gates to the meat conglomerate and the power of women, as written on the bottom, the woman here having the key to the gate. At the Eldridge Street Synagogue, this would come through in many ways. First, as part of the protests, two women actually seize the floor of the sanctuary, go onto the men's section, onto the bima, and begin to protest the price increase as part of this protest. They are doing so in the presence of Isaac Gellis, who was a prominent congregant, one of the major donors to the building's construction, and as it so happens, one of the main kosher meat sausage distributors in the neighborhood. Needless to say, he wasn't particularly happy. You also can see this broader movement happening around that same time as women in the 1920s are allowed to become members in their own right for the first time, at least for those who aren't widowed. You can see the congregation moving with the broader events surrounding them. This is even more apparent as we get later into the 20th century. In 1924, Congress passes the National Origins Act, or Johnson-Reed Act, that restricts immigration to the United States. They will cap immigration, and the neighborhood will begin to shrink, as will the congregation, as more and more people leave and fewer come in to take their place. The building will fall apart as a result, not having enough money or resources to maintain it. You can see the interior of the sanctuary in the late 1980s, and early to late mid-1980s, in perhaps its worst state. The windows had pushed in, allowing the rain and snow and moisture to come inside. The building itself began to come undone, the walls falling apart. You can see the laths underneath the fallen plaster, and in some cases, even through to the brick behind it. This entire space, this entire sanctuary would be restored, as I mentioned earlier, over a 20-year, $20 million restoration project. And we are now open as the museum at Eldridge Street, which continues to preserve the space. As we've seen throughout its history, the neighborhood has helped shape the synagogue has helped shape the neighborhood of its history, and it has been shaped by it. With our next presentation from Andrew, as he discusses the Seward Park Library, we'll see as well that the same trends are seen through the library, in the library's case as well. It is worth noting, given their proximity, that there may have even been congregants who would have gone to the Seward Park Library to read books. They did have the largest Yiddish collection, at least in the city, if not the world. Andrew, you might have to correct me on that. And I know that probably the busiest time would have been Fridays just before sunset as they were going for their Sabbath books. They had something to read. It's just all part of the story at our colleague's institution. So I want to turn the floor over to him for him to pick up our tale.
Hello, everyone, and thank you, Scott, for that transition. So, what Scott has covered so far touches changes within the Lower East Side as immigrants from Eastern Europe and elsewhere grew to be the vast majority of the population. A Herald Tribune article published shortly after the Eldridge Street Synagogue was built described the Lower East Side as a, quote, foreign country altogether, end quote, where one could see sights and hear sounds in so many ways, a piece of the old country in a new land which was to the new Americans just as strange as this patch of land must have been to tourists from uptown. In such a way, the synagogue helped these newcomers adjust and adapt to their often hostile surroundings. But there was another approach to settling immigrants to the neighborhood. These pictures here are of Castle Gardens, which predated Ellis Island. When the synagogue was built in 1887, as Scott mentioned, it was a monument not only to the Jewish faith, but to a particularly Eastern European Jewish faith. Prior to the 1880s, most Jewish settlement in New York City had been from Western Europe. And in large part, these immigrants shared the same cultural values of the Anglo-Saxon majority in America at this time. Indeed, since the late 19th century, immigration from Great Britain, Germany, and Ireland had sharply decreased, while immigration from Southern and Eastern Europe and Asia sharply increased. A growing concern that the cultural rift between Anglo-American traditions and traditions brought by new waves of immigration would be too great to surmount became the cause of much unease. Now, second or third generation Americans, these assimilated and now much more affluent Western European Jewry, now puzzled over how this new immigrant population could become, well, Americans, much like they had in their own journey towards assimilating to secular American ways. There was little interest then in carrying the old country to a new environment such as there was at the synagogue. Instead, the focus would be on approaches of shedding habits of the old world, achieving an embrace of a brand of secularism framed as synonymous with the American way. This was the impetus over a number of social programs of this era, including settlement houses, parks, and of course, libraries. We can see these changes reflected in the landscape of the plot of land where the library and the park are now located. So we have 4 years represented: 1857, 1911, 1955, and the present day, more or less. In 1855, as you can see, there was very little apart from crowded, dingy tenements. Though through efforts by illustrious families and benefactors, from this barren ground grew parks, libraries, and edifices which housed efforts helping their brethren of the faith towards seeing benefits of the American way, such that it was no longer would the world of the immigrant, and indeed the values of the immigrant, be confined to the homestead. Rather, the idea was that their values would more frequently than before be picked up in public arenas, such as the public school. Or no longer would children play in the streets. Rather, they would play in designated play areas. And no longer would new immigrants be confined to the values of the home library. That is, if such a thing existed for these poor greenhorns. Rather, they would receive their values from publicly lended books and publicly available programming. In terms of educational programming, a popular approach overcoming the difficulties of cultural incongruity, as they called it, were Americanization programs. Practically speaking, this would involve teaching new Americans the English language, United States history, and lessons in civics. In more extreme cases, Americanization pressed upon the need for foreigners to shed the cultural habits brought with them from their country of origin. Naturally, the library's commitment to education, as well as their presence in major American cities where immigration was occurring, would make library work at the center of the Americanization debate. The institution that would eventually become the Seward Park Library branch, as we shall see, would lie at the heart of this debate. And this divide between assimilated Western Jewry and immigrant Eastern European Jewry, the very people who would have been among the constituents of the Eldridge Street Synagogue. The roots of the Seward Park Library's history predates even the New York Public Library system itself. Before the existence of the New York Public Library, there were a series of smaller circulating library systems, one of which was the Aguilar Free Circulating Library, which was a system founded by the Young Men Hebrew Association and the Hebrew Free School. The idea for this Aguilar Circulating Library was thought up at one of the Society's many annual strawberry festivals that the associations held. It had been decided that the best way of using the proceedings of selling strawberries and creams of all varieties ought to go towards the purchase of carefully selected literature for a free circulating library for the benefit of heavily Jewish neighborhoods, to help their Eastern European brethren to acquaint themselves with what they saw to be the finer things in life. The system was named after Grace Aguilar, a Sephardic Jewish author of the English language. Though the library sought to cater to a Jewish public, it was intentionally secular in character and welcomed patrons of all backgrounds. In November of 1886, this vision was realized with 4 locations serving the public. One of them was the East Broadway branch at 206 East Broadway. And when the Educational Alliance building opened up in 1889, the branch was moved inside this building, just across the street from where the Seward Park branch now stands. Almost immediately, the Aguilar East Broadway branch was immensely popular, its facilities being completely overwhelmed with demand. And like many other free circulating library systems at this time, the Aguilar system suffered from lack of coordination and cutbacks of municipal support. It was decided that consolidation with the new New York Public Library would provide a solution to the incoherence of the current system, as well as a centralized revenue stream. Thus, in 1903, the East Broadway branch became a branch of the New York Public Library, with funds being secured through Andrew Carnegie's gift to build a new branch. This new location would be at 192 East Broadway, just across the street, the Seward Park Library's present location. In this picture dated 1897, the park is not yet complete, as we can see, as the tenements had only been freshly raised. We can see the Educational Alliance building across the street here, where the East Broadway branch was located. And the building circled in red would be demolished to make way for the Seward Park Library. This building was demolished in 1908, and the library was completed in 1909. In its place would be the current Seward Park branch structure, which is on the left. It was designed by the architectural firm of Babb, Cook, and Welch, who was also responsible, by the way, for designing Andrew Carnegie's mansion on 91st Street, which is on the right. Do you notice a similarity between the mansion on the right and the library on the left? Like so many other library buildings at this time, the Seward Park branch was designed to be a palace for the people with large windows and public spaces, the exact opposite of the cramped tenements where the patronage lived. So it's funny to note how, despite the different missions of the synagogue and the library, there was a similar goal there to provide the tenant dwellers some more spacious surroundings, more grandiose surroundings. Yet there are some features of the Seward Park branch building that distinguish it from other library buildings and relate to the neighborhood at large. First of all, most other Carnegie buildings are mid-block and have limestone facades. Compare the 5 branches on the top row with the 3 pictures of the Seward Park branch at the bottom. Seward Park's building, as you can see, has a more municipal red brick style, an approach that was praised by architectural magazines of the time to be elegant, yet not so extravagant, to clash with the environs of the Jewish ghetto, as they said. The building was much larger than other branches in the system in order to accommodate the enormous and dense population of the Lower East Side. Indeed, the Seward Park branch was the most expensive of all the branches of the NYPL to construct. And so we can see how a part of the reason of the unique plottage of Seward Park branch was its ability to accommodate one of the most densely populated neighborhoods in the world. So in November of 1909, the branch opens, and it immediately becomes the center of a neighborhood which would never be so dense nor so foreign-born. That this was the case is most evident in the various club meetings, poetry clubs, plays, and other performances hosted in its early days. One of the most notable events was the Yiddish Forum series, which featured lectures on and other personnel who gave talks on heady aspects of Jewish thought and cultural life. The programs were so popular that the standing room only crowds could not fit in the community room. The lectures were thus moved to the second floor to accommodate more eager listeners. Another group of note was the Yiddish Mothers Club, who met every month ostensibly to discuss local and national issues of significance. The program was led by Yiddish-speaking staff members, The aim of the club was to provide a forum for Yiddish speakers while at the same time allowing for staff members to introduce mothers to the habits of the average American. One librarian remarked that the club was wonderful, though it was often difficult to persuade the mothers to talk about something other than the latest mob hit or criminal episode. Given the makeup of the neighborhood, it probably doesn't surprise you to see that many programs in the early days were for Yiddish speakers. Yet, as you may have inferred, services for Yiddishers were not always seen as a given. It was a question, an open question, which lay at the heart of the Americanization debate we referred to earlier. In stark contrast to the public library of today, back in those days, catering to immigrants who spoke foreign languages was not seen by all to be of benefit to them. For many made the case, as did the Western European philanthropists before them, that this would only encourage habits of the old country that would prevent assimilation into modern American life. Indeed, the very fact that books in Yiddish were lent at Seward Park was an anomaly, but many within the neighborhood felt that the branch was not doing enough for its Yiddish readership, resulting in an article in the paper called The Jewish Day, which harshly criticized the branch for the small size of the Yiddish collection, which was worn out from constant use. The chief librarian of Seward Park Branch at this time, in a report to the manager of circulation, strongly embodies a certain point of view when we read the response to these charges, saying, quote, "It is, of course, impossible to offer the majority of Yiddish books, for most of these books are complete trash. Far better if we are able to provide translations of fine literature," end quote. In any case, the purchase of Yiddish skyrocketed after the article was published, thanks to the efforts of librarian Ernestine Rose, pictured here, who believed strongly that collections ought to reflect the needs of the neighborhood. She is most famous for helping build the collection of the 135th Street branch, which would eventually become the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture. Lest we simplify a complicated issue, it's fair to remember that despite the paternalistic undertones of Americanization programs, which may upset today's listener, library literature on the whole reflected a generally progressive attitude towards immigrants at a time when culture was rife with theories of genetic inferiority and essential degeneracy of new immigrant groups. If one were to go so far as to claim efforts towards Americanization were nothing if not an agent of social control pushing the values of ruling elites, which is certainly reasonable, it would have to do so at the expense of downplaying the fact that these efforts expressed a rare form of concern in what could be a desert of hostility. After all, instruction is a two-way street. Often these programs brought librarians closer to the cultures of their constituency, serving as a bridge towards better, more equitable service. A seminal advisory pamphlet by the Cleveland librarian Eleanor E. Ledbetter is a shining example of the common responsibility felt by librarians towards their public. Ledbetter recommends that the librarian frequently leave the building to get to know the markets, clubs, and newspapers offered in foreign languages. While many efforts of librarians were sure to be met with suspicion or outright disdain, Ledbetter emphasizes the virtue of patience and persistence. We also ought to remember that it was not until the year 1903 that providing books to immigrants would be recognized in major journals of the librarian profession as an issue of serious concern. Echoing debates surrounding the Aguilar system, Edwin White Gaylord's Why Public Libraries Should Supply Books in Foreign Languages article argued that libraries ought to meet the needs of the working classes, whether they spoke English or not. However, typical of the educational pretenses of the day, Gaylord argued that the duty to morally uplift Americans of all ethnic backgrounds was too important to ignore. Therefore, the best books of the English language ought to be translated and offered at any library with a foreign-born population. This article was followed by a response from J. Maud Campbell in the Library Journal, who agreed that service to immigrants was important. However, Campbell believed that an effort to understand and make accommodations for the tastes of immigrants themselves was a better way to serve the foreign-born than by pushing a librarian's idea of wholesome material onto the patron. Well, despite the national grandstanding rhetorical grandstanding and the national conversation around library service to immigrants, actual efforts towards this end were frequently unsuccessful. A typical case of this is the Chicago Public Library System case by Eric Novotny, whose 1916 commitment to meeting the challenges of a changing Chicago fell woefully short, despite genuine efforts to train staff on how to conduct story times, properly perform reference work with immigrant populations. A decade after the plan's initial publication, books in languages other than English made up a measly 8% of all circulating materials. From book selection to outreach to foreign communities, the most significant barrier to service was usually due to the fact that most librarians did not speak the language of their constituents in areas of high immigration. So it is quite notable that we actually did have a couple of Yiddish speakers here at the Seward Park Library at the time the study was being performed. So oftentimes, despite best of intentions, library service to immigrants usually involved a slow process of getting to know various institutions in the neighborhood who could act as a conduit for explaining various library services. After all, to many new Americans, the very concept of borrowing books at no cost was a strange one. The Seward Park Library's immediate neighborhood population would see peak immigration and population in 1910, just a year after the Seward Park branch opened. Circulation at the branch would peak in 1911, just 2 years after opening day. From here, circulation would steadily decline as Seward Park's surrounding area would depopulate to almost half its density by the 1930s, halving circulation figures as well. Certainly, the immigration laws of 1924 that Scott referenced earlier had a dramatic effect not just on the synagogue and not just on the neighborhood, but on library circulation as well. The effect of the 1924 law on the neighborhood and Seward Park branch is put into even more dramatic effect when we compare the circulation numbers to that of the entire NYPL system, which saw an increase in borrowing during the same 15-year period, as we can see from this chart. While there is a steep decline in borrowing during the Second World War, the general trend was increasing circulation, as you can see. But the 1924 law capping immigration was not the only thing responsible for a decrease in population and borrowing. Many former patrons, in pursuit of this American way, sought greener pastures in this period in the boroughs of the Brooklyn and the Bronx. When one patron who relocated to the Bronx was asked why he left the old neighborhood, he simply replied, "I have a daughter to marry, don't I?" Many who had grown up on the Lower East Side sought to escape the stigma of poverty attached to it. Massive efforts in slum clearance were undergone as a result of the extreme depopulation and dilapidation of the area, clearing out old tenements whose bathrooms were in the hallways and water ran cold, and whose rooms were often empty shelves of once crowded family life, echoes of former joys and sorrows perhaps still discernible to those who might care to listen. So most people were not charmed by a past remembered by most to be one of deprivation and hardship, looking forward to the new buildings that would introduce all new modern conveniences one came to expect in post-war America. Though hope was that circulation at the Seward Park Library would rise after massive cooperative and public housing buildings were built in their place, no such increase occurred on a significant level. And in 1956, the third floor, which was the reference floor, was closed to the public, much to the lament of readers and librarians themselves. One librarian, reflecting on her tenure with the NYPL that began at the branch in 1916, remarked in 1964 that, quote, "I suppose people have not the stamina and hunger for learning they once did to climb 3 flights of stairs," end quote. Long were the days of the Yiddish Mothers Club, the Yiddish Forum, and other programs meant to appeal to Lower East Siders. But the story doesn't end here. For new immigrants from Puerto Rico and after 1965 Immigration and Nationality Act, Asia eventually came to this patch of Manhattan Island, bringing with them reading habits of their own. If the Seward Park librarians in the 50s were lamenting the closed third floor and the lack of imagination of their programming in comparison to times past, the Seward Park Library of today has for years now opened its third floor to the public, and on average day, it is so busy that it can be hard to find a place to sit. Circulation numbers also greatly exceed those of the mid-20th century, rivaling figures of the 1920s. So most of our world language collection circulation is in Chinese rather than Yiddish or Hebrew. And our programming is as creative and busy as ever, featuring book discussions, lectures, story times, crafting and knitting hours, and even film screenings. And with the new park renovation, the branch looks more collegiate than ever, evoking its being a university of the people, with the courtyard's red brick patternwork matching the library's own, inspired by Raphael's school of Athens. It really is an exciting time to be in the neighborhood. And that pretty much ends it for me.
Andrew, Scott, thank you both so much for such fascinating conversation and lecture. I'm already receiving notes from people saying that they were really sorry they missed the first part and that they are really enjoying this. So we have a few questions that are coming in right now. And the first question is really about the neighborhood itself. People are curious about the people who weren't Jewish in the neighborhood in 1900s, and they want to know who they were. So if either of you can comment on that.
Well, I will say it can be difficult to discern who were the non-Jewish members. And a lot of the reason for that is because census taking during the time that Scott and I are talking about, they categorize people by language. So just for example, in the immediate area of the Seward Park Library, it just says Russian, 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 Russian. You see a German every now and then, but it's mostly Russian, 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 Russian. They're talking about a language there. They're not really talking about, a religion. So it's tough to say. Scott, do you have anything to add there?
Absolutely, and I want to build on what you're saying. Even for us at the museum, parsing out who attended services on a particular day is limited because even the record keeping on that end is equally limited. The congregation was only recording people who had been members, and so if you were just coming, this question may have been reference to the non-Jewish attendees, maybe of the at the synagogues during the services, and it's really impossible to figure out who they were or even where they're coming from. The other things I would add to that is that Allen Street, which is 1 block away from the Eldridge Street where the synagogue is located, was an elevated train line. And believe it or not, and I wish this were still the case today, it only cost 5 cents back then to ride the subway. And so you could get all the way up to 96th Street, which was the northern terminus of the line, or all the way south to Chatham Square. And so you could really be coming from anywhere up or down the Lower East Side. And that extended through many neighborhoods from Chinatown, which is anchored in and around Columbus Park, just on the other side of Foley Square, through the Jewish Lower East Side, through Alphabet City, and all the way up into Yorkville, which is where the German community moved to after they left the Lower East Side in the late 1870s. So it really could have been anyone. I would just add one more fact to answer this question. I came across a few years ago a guidebook that was given out by the folks who did statistical guides to New York City, and it was a travel guide given out to folks who stayed at the Astor Square Hotel in Union Square, and the entire book was filled with profiles of different neighborhoods, and it included the Jewish Lower East Side as well. It describes the street scenes, and it may have very well been the case that people who were coming to listen to Pincus or coming to the Seward Park Library may have been even visitors to New York City who were just looking to see something new and different. As to identifying them or telling you, who they were, where they were coming from, as Andrew said, it would really be difficult, if possible at all, to say.
And knowing that it's difficult to say, do you have records of what other foreign language materials aside from Yiddish were in the library during that period of time?
Yeah, actually, meticulous records were kept until the 40s or 50s, I believe. I actually wrote a paper on that. Most of the books that were at this branch were in first place was Yiddish, absolutely. Second place was Hebrew, and third place was Russian. This was, as I mentioned, this was an anomaly because one thing that came out also that also came out of the study that I mentioned of the Chicago Public Library System was that most foreign language collections were usually in languages of in Western European languages such as French and German. So it was these New York Public Library branches that were really offering what their patrons were asking for, and not simply just great classics of the Western European tradition, right? If you go down to another library, you would find more Italian books, right? If you went down to another library, you would find more books in, whichever language the patronage around there was. But we really were dealing with a heavily Yiddish speaking population at this time. And so we did have some books in, there was like a smattering of Italian. And you didn't really see Spanish on the menu until the 40s when people from Puerto Rico started coming in. Yeah.
And here's a question for Scott, and it's about the people who would attend the Eldridge Street Synagogue at the time. Someone wants to know, how would they even get to the synagogue during Shabbat and other high holy days, if they weren't living in the neighborhood, that is?
So this is a great question, and there's actually some bit of struggle with this with the congregation a little bit later on. The congregation is Orthodox, and so they could not do anything during the Sabbath, so sundown Friday to sundown Saturday, that would violate that. That includes paying tolls, pressing buttons, flipping switches, lighting matches, and actually in the entrance level of our sanctuary, there's actually a snuff box to hold chewing tobacco, so they didn't have to light their cigarettes during the Sabbath. In terms of the congregation, if you wanted to attend service, you couldn't do any of those things. You couldn't take the subway, you couldn't pay for a cab or a carriage or anything of the sort. You literally had to live within walking distance. And so when you several decades in, as people are beginning to move to Brooklyn, to the Bronx, to other parts of the city, there is actually a desire to build a sister sanctuary, for lack of a better term, or a satellite for the congregation uptown, where the other folks have moved. The decision is taken not to do that, so they never do build a second site. But there is this tension of wanting to stay within the community, but not being able to if you're moving out.
And speaking of the population, someone also wanted to know, what was the literacy rates back then of the population on the Lower East Side? Someone said, are the Yiddish and Hebrew texts also indicative of the education level of the immigrant population?
Well, sometimes there is an emphasis on education even when there isn't literacy, and so you have the children coming to the library. This is often the case that, I used to work in the children's department, and even amongst the current immigrant groups coming into the branch, you have grandparents who cannot read in their native spoken language, who just know that being at the library is a good place for them because of the attention to education, culturally speaking, right? And so I think even if you had a lot of illiterate immigrants coming into this area, that's not to say that they didn't want something better for their children. And this was often the case. The children's department at the Seward Park Library has always been very busy for this reason.
And I guess going off of that and talking about pushing for education, some people also wanted to know about the Education Alliance in the neighborhood. And if you can explain to our listeners what the Education Alliance is and the role that they served for the community.
Well, sure. I mean, if we can think back to what I was talking about, setting up the arena with the this idea about what it means for an immigrant group to assimilate into American life. What does that mean? That means something different depending on your generation, of course. Now, to talk about the Educational Alliance broadly, we have to talk about settlement houses in particular. The settlement house idea, the reason why they're called settlements is because the idea was that, and this is the original idea, was that university graduates of, very well-bred households would go down into slum areas and pass all the great things of their own culture onto the poor. This wasn't originally an idea that was rooted in immigration, however. It first started in London, England, where you had Oxbridge students coming down to a settlement house in London. It was the first settlement house ever, and teaching the East Enders of London, which is where my family's from, actually. The great, works of civilization, all this other stuff. This idea catches wind in the United States, and it's more applied to the question of Americanization and immigrant groups. The first of which in New York City is the university settlement. So a lot of people wonder, why is it called the university settlement? Well, it's because the idea behind the settlement house movement is you would have people coming from the universities. And so that's where it gets that name. The Educational Alliance is in that tradition, except again, it's money is mostly coming from Western European Jewish philanthropists, right? Philanthropists who wanted to give back to the neighborhood, right? All you have to do is look at the monuments of the Lower East Side, and you see these names: Nathan Strauss of Strauss Square, for instance. It doesn't take long to discover some of these names. And the Educational Alliance really came out of that, this particularly Jewish strain of this settlement house movement, right? And that's basically what the Educational Alliance was. And what they did and what they continue to do is provide resources such as classes, such as workshops, such as community fairs, information, stuff like that. We've always had a very deep relationship with them. I mean, we started there, as you know, for the presentation. So.
Great, thank you so much. Someone also wants to know about Ernestine Rose. Is she the same person as the notable suffragette?
She is indeed. She was very, very politically active. In fact, we have many politically active librarians at the Seward Park branch. A part of what we didn't get to today was almost as much a part of the Jewish tradition as the faith, as learning at the library, is also radicalism. And you have the Forward building right across the street, which published the Daily Forward, which was the Yiddish language newspaper, socialist Yiddish language newspaper. And Maud Malone was another one of these, not Jewish, but Irish activists who was a librarian here at the Seward Park branch. But we have this really incredible artifact in our archives of a children's librarian's journal in 1917, where it's a slow day on the children's floor, and she looks out the window and she sees a riot breaking out in the Forward building, and she sees Emma Goldman being arrested. This librarian was also made numerous casual journal entries of meeting in what was then Rutgers Square, and passing the hat around for funding various socialist causes of the area. So a lot of activist librarians working out of Seward Park Library, known and unknown.
And I'll just throw in a plug there. We at the museum at Eldridge Street actually launched our first activism on the Lower East Side history walking tour last weekend. So if people do want to learn a little bit more about these movements and about the roles of suffragettes, please, you can look at our website and sign up. We have another one coming up this October, because there really are such incredible stories, and the Lower East Side neighborhood has such a rich history. about them, and as Andrew said, monuments as well. And Scott wants to add on to that.
Absolutely. And just to build on what Andrew and what Sophie has been saying, there are so many great sites. In fact, a lot of it was centered very close to where the Seward Park Library was, as Andrew mentioned, the Forward Building in Strauss Square. There's also one other notable site right in that same area. If you get a chance to go to the Forward Building and you see on the far right-hand corner of the block, it's now a Chinese restaurant with it's a gold sign in red lettering. That used to be the Garden Cafe, where a lot of the socialist members of the neighborhood would go to and would hold court. And in fact, Leon Trotsky, when he was sort of in the wilderness years here in the US, he would hold court at the Garden Cafe. And the sign to that Garden Cafe, as it was being demolished, they were actually going to throw it out. And they went, I'm not sure whether they came to us or we went to them, but we actually managed to get that sign to the Garden Cafe, and it's now hanging in our museum on display. So there's absolutely a lot of history. The other thing I can't let go of the floor before I mention is there's just this tension in the neighborhood between the socialist and the socialist end, and then the capitalist end. And the Forward Building itself was actually built because they didn't want the capitalist bank building down the road to be the tallest building in the neighborhood. So there was this big community, a lot of different ideas, and it was really right at this area where those ideas were constantly churning.
And Scott, for our viewers who are coming from other parts of the world, can you just tell them what the Forward is?
So the Jewish Daily Forward was one of the largest Jewish newspapers in the world, and in that period it was published in 3 languages: English, Yiddish, and Russian. There were 200 to 300,000 copies published a day. It was very active in local politics, in local community. Its building would be adorned with 47 torches to continue to play on the phrase that gives the Forward its name. Socialism, you see, was supposed to light the way forward like the torch. And right next to the torches are the effigies of the forefathers of communism, including Marx and Engels, something you'll hear on the tour. The paper was designed to help talk about issues and to get the word out. And they were one of their best known, perhaps longest lasting impacts was the Bintel Brief, which is the Dear Abby, essentially, for the Lower East Side. It's this advice column where people all around the neighborhood would write about day-to-day issues, everything from issues involving fair work and labor to issues of gender, to one father who doesn't want to let his kid play baseball because he thinks it might distract him from his studies. And if anyone's interested in really getting that firsthand perspective of the Lower East Side, the Bintel Brief book collection of letters is a really fantastic glimpse into this era as well. And
the building itself, the site, it's still there today, and you can see in large letters it says Forward on the top of the building. When you're standing on East Broadway near Seward Park, you can still see it. And as one of our guests here is saying, the Forward is still being published, although it's no longer being printed, it's only online. And yes, someone is saying the Forward is still very active today and includes the Bintel Brief podcast. So,
if I might add an irony there, that the building which once published a socialist newspaper is now luxury housing, which is a very New York story. They used to broadcast election results on the side of the Forward Building. It was such a center of the neighborhood, and the building was so conspicuous with its height and all that. It was a real.
Absolutely. I to build on what Andrew said, I actually got a glimpse into one of those apartments through, I think it was the Post. The nephew of Andrzej Versace bought one of those apartments for, I think this was about 2008, but it was 2.137 million for the 2-bedroom on the first floor, actually, not bad.
Some few more questions before we wrap some things up. Someone wants to know what kind of jobs the immigrants of the neighborhood had? Perhaps Scott, this question is something you can answer.
So it really could vary depending on the circumstances, depending on what you did in Eastern Europe, what skills you brought to the table, so to speak. By and large, perhaps the most notable ones, there was going to be a handful. You could be a garment worker, and that really did split between the genders. You could have both men and female garment workers, is what I mean to say. Though the jobs within the garment factory or the sweatshop could differ. As Diane is saying, tailors and seamstresses, absolutely. Pushcart peddlers was another big job. I think you saw a bunch of them in that street image from the first part of the presentation. And you could really sell anything from that cart. It was something that that many immigrants would bring with them. They had done this in the old country, and they were bringing it to the new one. People would come from all around, even uptown, to get some really great deals. It was almost like a perpetual farmer's market because there were no fixed prices. And even in between then, you would have book dealers and merchants and pickle stores. Pickle stores was the other big one. You had hundreds of pickle stores in the neighborhood. You couldn't turn a corner without smelling the brine from a pickle. If only that were true today. I love pickles. And there's just really a host of other professions. Newsboys also, if you were going to sell a paper, you could go out and sell them. Really anything. But the two I kind of love, I really want to mention the most are New York City jobs, actually a bit closer to Andrew. The Parks Department actually hired 2 attendants for Seward Park when it first opened to make sure the kids were following the rules. And one of the key rules of Seward Park when it first opened in 1903 was that boys had their section and girls had their sections and they couldn't mix. And that was really strictly enforced. That was 2 jobs right there.
And one more question to kind of connect us back to where we are today. Someone is really curious about the rooftop that Andrew, you were showing earlier, and they wanted to know if it was still being used today, and especially thinking about right now in the time of COVID and thinking about the present. Are people still using that? And what other purposes might it have?
It's a great question. I mean, the roof is still intact. You can still go up there, but it's not open to the public. And the reason for that is because there's a large air conditioner on top of there now. So if you can imagine, a part of the purpose a rooftop reading room serves is to introduce cool air and breezes on a hot, humid New York summer day. These days we have air conditioner, so it sort of makes the roof a moot point. However, that doesn't mean it's not a nice idea. Now, the reason why it could be something like a legal issue, maybe there's some sort of legal issue with getting people too close to an air conditioning unit. I don't know. There's all sorts of strange legal issues for all sorts of things. It could be a safety issue. Maybe the roof has not been tested for public access, but I have a feeling that it is more a staffing issue. NYPL has a rule that no member of the public can be alone in any room at any time without a member of staff being there. So if we did have a rooftop reading room, we would probably have to have another member of staff being up there at all times. And already a 3-floor branch we're one of the larger branches, so we're already scrambling for staff. Frequently, I'm ashamed to say, but yeah, those are some reasons why it's not in operation. But interestingly enough, there were 12 branches that had rooftop reading rooms. We are the only one whose building remains standing. Or sorry, we're the only one who's continuing operation as a library. There's another building that remains standing, which was called the Rivington Street branch. They closed it in 1942 due to depopulation of the neighborhood. This building was turned into a church, and now they're turning it into luxury housing. So.
There's a trend there. Yeah. Once again, Scott, Andrew, and particularly to our audience members who have been with us for now over an hour, I want to thank all of you for being with us here today. And I want to also invite all of you to come visit us on the Lower East Side come to the library, come to the museum at Eldridge Street. You can go on a walking tour with us and then grab a book at the library. Both of us, we both have programs and other wonderful types of things that we do. So again, thank you all. And thank you to Manny, again, the organization who's helped really support this program this evening. So thanks.
Thank you for having me, and so long, everyone. Good night.
Thanks, everyone. Have a good night.
Good night, everyone. Thank you again. And I also do want to say, if you want to sign up for any of our mailing lists, you may do so. We do have an active mailing list, and we share out information about our programs, walking tours. We even have concerts. And we also offer different kinds of tours, building tours as well. So please, if you're coming in from all over the world, you can plan your visit with us today. So once again, thank you so much. My colleague Maya has shared links from our website for you to take a look at. And I'm also going to share with you now the links for our mailing list for those of you who are still with us listening to me talk right now. Actually, if you go onto our website at eldridgestreet.org, and then you scroll all the way down to the bottom of the page, you'll see a special area where you can sign up for our newsletter. So once again, thank you all and good night.